In 2002, the Monterey Bay Aquarium released an orphaned sea otter pup into Elkhorn Slough, a nutrient-choked California estuary north of Monterey Bay, raised not by humans, but by a non-releasable female otter named Toola, who had taken the stranded pup as her own behind the glass of the aquarium's exhibit tank. Over the next 14 years, 36 more orphaned pups would follow the same path, stranded on California beaches, rescued within days of birth, raised by surrogate mothers, and released into the brackish waters of a slough that had been ecologically collapsing for half a century. By 2019, when researchers finally published the full 15-year dataset in the journal Oryx, what divers and scientists were documenting in Elkhorn Slough did not match any projection the program had made at the start. The eelgrass beds, which had collapsed to an all-time low of just 2 hectares by the early 1980s under an avalanche of agricultural runoff, had expanded 6-fold. The otter population had more than doubled. The surrogate-reared animals and their descendants now accounted for over half of all population growth in the estuary. And in the waters beneath them, an entire food web was reorganizing itself around the presence of a top predator that had been functionally absent from California estuaries for more than 100 years. This is the full story, from the fur trade that erased sea otters from the Pacific coast, to the unprecedented surrogacy program that raised orphaned pups by having captive females teach them how to be wild, to what divers in Elkhorn Slough are now finding beneath the surface of a bay that scientists had given up on. Most videos about sea otter recovery show you a cute floating animal and call it a success story. This one follows the data. 15 years deep into the stranded pups, the caretakers who wore dark cloaks to prevent imprinting, the one emblematic otter who was orphaned 3 days old and is now raising wild pups of her own, the failed translocation in the 1980s at San Nicolas Island that showed everyone what not to do, and the peer-reviewed scientific evidence that is only now revealing what happens when a keystone species returns to an estuary the human eye had written off as dead. Every claim in this video is sourced from the 2021 Mayer study in Oryx, the International Journal of Conservation, the 2013 Hughes paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, peer-reviewed follow-up research published in Biological Conservation in 2023, and official monitoring data from the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Sea Otter program. This is not speculation. This is what the 15-year survival records and the eelgrass survey data actually show. But before you can understand what the otters are doing now, you need to understand what the California coast lost when they disappeared, and why bringing even a small population back required scientists to invent an entirely new conservation technique that had never been tried on a marine mammal before. The southern sea otter is not a decorative animal. It is the smallest marine mammal in North America, weighing between 30 and 70 pounds. But it carries a biological adaptation unlike anything else in the sea. Sea otters have the densest fur of any animal on Earth, approximately 1 million hairs per square inch. That fur is the only thing keeping them alive in the cold water of the California coast, because unlike whales, seals, or sea lions, sea otters have no blubber. None. A sea otter that gets wet skin in cold water dies, which means they spend hours every day grooming, trapping a layer of air next to their skin that insulates them from water that would kill them in minutes. To fuel that grooming and the furnace metabolism that keeps them warm, a sea otter has to eat roughly 25% of its body weight every single day, the caloric equivalent of a human adult eating 40 pounds of food daily. They dive for it, sometimes as deep as 250 feet, pulling crabs, clams, urchins, abalone, and snails from the rocks and the muddy bottom. They are among the only non-primate mammals known to use tools routinely, smashing shellfish open against rocks balanced on their chest as they float on their back. But here is what makes the sea otter irreplaceable. It is a keystone species. That is not a metaphor. It is a formal ecological designation, and sea otters are the species for which the category was originally defined. When a keystone predator is present in an ecosystem, it regulates the entire food web beneath it. When it disappears, the whole structure collapses, not gradually, but cascadingly, as every species below reorganizes itself around the absence. Later in this video, you will see exactly what that cascade looks like when it runs in reverse, when the predator returns after a century of absence and the food web starts rebuilding itself in real time. The data is unlike anything the program expected. But first, how California lost these animals in the first place. When you remove a keystone predator from a coastline for over 100 years, you do not just lose a species. You lose the structure of an entire ecosystem. And California lost that structure deliberately. Before European contact, an estimated 150,000 to 300,000 sea otters ranged along the North Pacific coast, from northern Japan through Alaska, down through British Columbia and California, all the way to Baja California in Mexico. Then, beginning in 1741, the maritime fur trade arrived on the Pacific coast. Sea otter pelts were the most valuable fur in the world. The commercial hunt that followed ran for 170 years, and it became the most efficient extinction campaign ever directed at a marine mammal. By 1911, when the International Fur Seal Treaty finally outlawed the hunting of sea otters, the species was considered functionally extinct across its entire range. The total surviving California population was estimated at approximately 50 animals clinging to a single remote stretch of the Big Sur coast, from hundreds of thousands to 50 in just over a century and a half. The consequences were not just a wildlife tragedy. They were an ecological catastrophe that rewrote the structure of the Pacific near shore. Without sea otters preying on urchins, urchin populations exploded across the coast. Urchins graze kelp. Unchecked urchin populations grazed entire kelp forests to nothing, converting rich, three-dimensional underwater forests into barren rock expanses that scientists now call urchin barrens. Fish populations that depended on kelp for spawning and shelter collapsed. Invertebrate diversity collapsed. Nearshore productivity collapsed. The coast that European sailors had described in the 1700s as teeming with life looked, by 1950, like an underwater desert. And in California's estuaries, the shallow, brackish bays where rivers meet the sea, the damage was compounded by something else. Agricultural runoff from the farms of the Salinas Valley poured nitrogen into the water in steadily increasing quantities. By 2005, fertilizer sales in the Elkhorn Slough watershed had risen from 200 tons per year in the 1930s to 30,000 tons per year. The nutrients fed algal blooms. The algae grew on the leaves of eelgrass, the seagrass that forms the foundational habitat for nursery fish, juvenile salmon, herring, halibut, and hundreds of invertebrate species. The algae blocked sunlight. The eelgrass died. By the early 1980s, eelgrass cover in Elkhorn Slough had collapsed to just 2 hectares, essentially gone. The system was double damaged, no top predator, and too many nutrients. Scientists watching the slough assumed it was a lost cause. What California tried next would take 2 decades, require the invention of a technique that had never been tested on any marine mammal, and depend on the survival instincts of orphaned pups who, in most cases, had been separated from their mothers on the day they were born. And it almost did not happen. The first attempt to restore sea otters in California through active human intervention took place in the late 1980s. Between 1987 and 1990, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service translocated 140 wild sea otters from the central California coast to San Nicolas Island, far off the coast of Los Angeles, in an attempt to establish an insurance population against oil spills. The translocation was a failure. Of the 140 otters moved, most either died, disappeared, or swam hundreds of miles back to where they had come from. Only a handful remained on San Nicolas. The project was declared over. The lesson, as one aquarium researcher later put it, was that wild adult otters with an established home range will almost always try to return to it. You cannot simply pick up an otter and drop it somewhere else. The animal will vote with its flippers. But at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, a completely different idea was taking shape. The aquarium had been rescuing stranded sea otter pups since the 1980s, orphans found on beaches, often just days old, separated from their mothers by storms, disease, or shark attack. The initial approach was to raise them by hand, with human caretakers feeding them formula and teaching them to groom. It did not work. Hand-raised pups imprinted on humans, and they did not survive in the wild. Then, in 2001, a non-releasable female sea otter in the aquarium's exhibit, a rescued adult named Toola, who could not return to the wild herself, did something unexpected. When a stranded pup was placed in the exhibit tank, Toola adopted it. She groomed it. She let it crawl onto her chest and sleep. She taught it how to open shellfish, how to dive, and how to behave like an otter. The caretakers realized they had stumbled onto something unprecedented in marine mammal conservation, a captive female willing to raise an orphan not of her own. What happened next took roughly 5 years, and it produced the scientific foundation for a 15-year rescue program that would eventually restore an entire estuary. The program that grew out of Toola's first adoption was built on precise, almost paranoid protocols. Orphaned pups, sometimes rescued within hours of separation from their mothers, were brought to the aquarium. Human caretakers who fed the youngest pups, those under about 8 weeks old, wore dark cloaks and face shields so the infants never learned what a human face looks like. The goal was to keep the pups ecologically naive until they were old enough to be introduced to a surrogate mother. At around 8 weeks of age, once a pup had shed its fluffy natal coat, a pelage so buoyant the pup literally floats like a cork and cannot dive, it was transferred to the exhibit tank. A non-releasable female otter was allowed to adopt the pup. Over the next 4 to 6 months, the surrogate mother did what wild mothers do. She taught the pup to groom, to dive, to identify food, and to open shells. Sea otter mothers rarely let their pups out of sight for the first 6 months of life, and the surrogates at the aquarium behaved the same way. At approximately 7 months of age, the juvenile otter was ready for release. The release site was chosen deliberately. Elkhorn Slough, a 7-mile estuary 30 kilometers north of the aquarium, had a small existing population of male otters, abundant prey resources, accessible waterways for monitoring, and critically, degraded ecological conditions that researchers hoped sea otters might help repair. The first surrogate-raised juvenile was released there in 2002. Between 2002 and 2016, 36 more followed. 37 orphans in total were released back into the wild by otters who had been orphans themselves. But the program was far from a guaranteed success. Every released pup carried a surgically implanted radio transmitter. The first 2 weeks after each release were treated as a soft release, a conditioning period when field teams monitored the animal daily by telemetry and by visual observation. If a pup was not foraging successfully, it was recaptured. Survival was not assumed, it was verified. The biggest surprise was not whether the otters survived, it was where they decided to stay. The great failure of the San Nicolas translocation had been that the wild adult otters kept trying to go home, but the surrogate-reared pups had no home to go back to. Most had been orphaned on the day they were born. They had never established a territory. They had no ecological memory of anywhere else. And so, when they were released into Elkhorn Slough, they stayed. 90% of released females and 80% of males remained in the slough after release. That was a retention rate no prior translocation program had ever come close to achieving. The emblematic case was Sea Otter 327. She was rescued in 2005. After stranding at Morro Strand State Beach when she was 3 days old, alone and hypothermic. She was brought to the aquarium, transferred to Toola, and raised through the full surrogacy protocol. She was released into Elkhorn Slough as a juvenile. She stayed. She reached breeding age. She mated with a wild male. And she began producing wild-born pups of her own. every reproductive cycle in the same slough where she had been released. An animal that had been orphaned 3 days into her life became, through a chain of human and otter caregivers, a mother of wild California sea otters. By 2016, when the original study's release window closed, the arithmetic was clear. 37 surrogate-reared pups were released. At least 8 females had successfully survived and reproduced in the slough. Median age-specific survival rates for surrogate-reared otters were virtually indistinguishable from those of wild-born sea otters along the Monterey Peninsula. The technique worked, and the population responded. And that is where the story gets truly interesting. What researchers documented in Elkhorn Slough after 15 years was not just a species surviving. It was an entire food web reorganizing itself around the returned presence of a top predator. The first surprise was demographic. When Dr. M. Tim Tinker, a sea otter population biologist who had built a mathematical model of the slough's population dynamics, ran the numbers, the results were unambiguous. The surrogate-reared otters and their descendants accounted for more than half of all observed population growth in Elkhorn Slough during the 15-year study period. That growth could not be explained without them. The slough had been limping along with a small, male-dominated population that could not reproduce on its own. The surrogate-reared females changed that by establishing breeding in an estuary that had been ecologically incomplete for generations. What the eelgrass divers were seeing underwater was a direct consequence. And that was only the demographic surprise. What the otters did to the ecosystem itself was something else entirely. In 2013, a team led by Dr. Brent Hughes at the University of California, Santa Cruz published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled "Recovery of a Top Predator Mediates Negative Eutrophic Effects on Seagrass." It was, to use a technical phrase, a trophic cascade paper, documenting what happens when an apex predator returns to an ecosystem and changes the behavior of every species beneath it. Here is what the Hughes team documented. Sea otters do not eat eelgrass. They do not even interact with eelgrass directly. But sea otters eat crabs in large quantities, and they have a strong preference for the 2 cancer crab species that dominate Elkhorn Slough. The crabs, in turn, eat small grazing invertebrates, sea slugs, and isopods that scientists now know function as the cleaning crew of an eelgrass meadow. Those grazers crawl up and down the eelgrass blades, scraping off the algae that agricultural runoff would otherwise allow to smother the plants. When sea otters were absent from Elkhorn Slough, the crabs were abundant. The crabs ate the grazers. The algae grew unchecked. The eelgrass suffocated. But when sea otters returned, crab populations crashed. The grazers rebounded. The eelgrass leaves were scoured clean. Sunlight reached the plants. The meadows expanded 6-fold compared to the 1980s low. In an estuary where nutrient pollution had been rising for decades, eelgrass was recovering. Not because the pollution was fixed, but because the predator at the top of the food chain had returned and was regulating the system again from above. Divers in the slough were documenting eelgrass meadows where there had been bare mud a decade earlier. They were finding juvenile fish, halibut, herring, and salmon using the recovered meadows as nursery habitat. They were documenting increased shorebird activity on banks where otter-stabilized vegetation had returned. A single species, restored by a surrogacy program that had never been attempted on a marine mammal before, had rewritten the ecological rules of an entire California estuary. The full dimensions of what the otters have done are still being quantified. A 2023 follow-up study published in Biological Conservation titled "Advancing Surrogate Rearing: Methods to Enhance Southern Sea Otter Recovery" documented 2 decades of refinements to the technique and confirmed that it remains one of the most effective tools available for restoring sea otter populations. The Monterey Bay Aquarium is now evaluating Morro Bay as the next release site, another California estuary where sea otter numbers are low and eelgrass is in decline. The technique that began with a single captive otter adopting a single orphaned pup is now a replicable conservation methodology. The third surprise was cultural. Sea otters are one of the most popular charismatic megafauna in North America. Tourists come to Monterey specifically to see them. The Monterey Bay Aquarium's live sea otter exhibit is among the most visited attractions of any aquarium in the world. Kayakers on Elkhorn Slough now routinely encounter rafts of dozens of floating otters, many of them descended from the surrogacy program. The economic argument for marine mammal restoration, often abstract before a program begins, became concrete the moment families in small boats began seeing wild pups nursing on their mothers' chests in the calm water of a recovering slough. Before the fur trade, California's sea otters ranged from just north of San Francisco Bay all the way south into Baja California. The historical record of that range survived the extinction, in old ship logs, in indigenous oral tradition, and in place names like Otter Rock and Otter Cove scattered along a coast that had not seen a wild otter in generations. The word survived, the animal did not. For over a century, those names described a species that lived only in the memories of the people who had watched them be killed. Now, the animal is back. At least in one slough, at least in the descendants of 37 orphaned pups who were raised by surrogate mothers behind aquarium glass and released into a dying estuary that nobody expected to recover. The current California range still extends only 480 kilometers of the central coast, from around Santa Cruz down to Santa Barbara. The species is still listed as threatened under the United States Endangered Species Act. The historical range has not been fully recovered, but the proof of concept is now in the water. Surrogate-reared otters can restore a population. That population can restore an ecosystem. And what one California estuary has shown over 15 years is that recovery, once begun, accelerates in ways the models did not predict. 37 orphan pups, 15 years. A surrogacy program that had never been tested on a marine mammal before, built by an aquarium, an adult female named Toola who decided to adopt the first pup ever placed with her, and a team of scientists who wore dark cloaks so the babies would never learn what a human looks like. And a population of sea otters that is now writing its own future across the waters of a California estuary that, as recently as the 1980s, was functionally collapsing. But California is not the only place where a single returned species is reshaping an ecosystem in ways scientists did not predict. In our next video, we go to Ireland, to a coastline that had not seen a white-tailed eagle in over a century, and where 245 Norwegian chicks released over 18 years are now doing something the satellite data is still struggling to explain. If you thought 37 surrogate-raised otters could reshape an estuary, wait until you see what happens when Europe's largest bird of prey returns to the country that spent 200 years trying to exterminate it. You will not look at ecosystem recovery the same way again.